The Pattern Gallery, as you know, has had a unique semester. This is a little different than what we normally do for shows. As Eric and I have been working on that about the last 3 years, we usually have exhibits come to us, but this semester is all about reuse. So we've reused a lot of this furniture, we've reused the walls, and this is becoming a space for students and faculty to use. So there's a lot of classes that are happening in here this semester. We have yoga classes on Monday nights, with our last class being next week. What else? Anything else to say about this semester? So it's been fun, something different. But our goal is always throughout the Pattern Gallery to have a few talks and a few discussions. So we're lucky to have Marccus, Willow, and Brandy with us here today. So our theme is on resilience and environmental justice. And we invited these guests particularly because Marccus's research on urban flooding and its influence on social vulnerability and mobility relates similarly to Willow's work with focusing on urban policies and plans and how they can contribute to and can address social inequality, particularly in neighborhoods undergoing rapid racial and economic change. And then Brandy's management on resiliency and sustainable programs and the environmental financing, the EFC, kind of brings us all together. So to start out with, we're just going to have a very casual conversation today, so please feel free to ask questions and get engaged. But we're going to start with just an overview question. Sorry, I could get a little bit better organized. How would you define social justice and environmental resilience? And let's go left to right.
So how would I define social justice and environmental resilience? So social justice, I think of as the opportunities of people to fulfill their highest human potential without regard to the circumstances of their birth, right? Whether that be your zip code or whether that be your race, gender, disability. But the potential to grow and to the freedom to expand your possibilities and really follow your path. Right? And I think the social injustices that we see are the barriers that communities and particular social groups face in that trajectory. And so environmental resilience, I'll leave it to these folks to do a better job of explaining what environmental resilience means today and through the literature, but I think of environmental resilience as, I think of environment broadly defined. So I think one of the things that I think probably I will continue to press on the discussion today is how narrowly often we think about the environment as disconnected from issues of housing, transportation, economics, politics, and place. And so when I think about environmental resilience, I think about community resilience. I think about what defines an environment or a place, and I think about that term very broadly. And resilience I think of as the ability of communities to bounce back in the face of an external threat, to the sustainability or the viability of that place. And I think of external threats also very broadly. So I think in most cases, environmental resilience, we're talking about, a particular storm or a hazard, but we also have community hazards like gentrification, like highways that go through communities that also disrupt the viability and the ability of those communities to bounce back. So I think I would think about that term a little bit more broadly than traditionally.
You're going to hear a lot of echoing and repeating. So when I think about social justice, I echo Willow's sentiment that it's really about, regardless of whether your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your economic status, all these things that we didn't necessarily choose when we were born, and having the ability and capability of going to full potential. I mean, because at this point we're even just talking about basic civil liberties, but we're not even how do you get to your potential, but how do we make sure that the laws on the book are translated to applications so that regardless of your status or your race or anything of that nature, even your basic civil liberties are being protected and you're able to take on the same opportunities regardless of all those variables. And then for environmental resilience, again, to echo Willow, I had a hard time with that question because I don't think about it in terms of resilience isn't an environmental issue, it's very community-based, and so similar to sustainability, which is that three-legged stool of environment, economics, and social issues. When I think about environmental resilience or resilience, it's really how can a community or an individual bounce back from disruption or some sort of disaster. And as we know, oftentimes the communities that are most vulnerable are going to have the hardest time bouncing back. So.
Yeah, I guess I attempted to sit at the end and not talk first, but now I'm sort of in this position where, yeah, I'm sort of repeating a lot. But to say something slightly different, I'll say that when I think about social justice, I think about it in sort of comparison and contrast to civil rights. And so when you think about civil rights and the civil rights movement, it was fundamentally about opportunities, right? And so the opportunity to vote, economic opportunities. When I think of social justice, it's fundamentally about outcomes, right? So not just sort of the opportunity to participate in some of these fundamental civil rights and liberties, but to actually have the outcomes that are, you know, equitable and equal in terms of housing, in terms of basic infrastructure, in terms of, you know, just living in a thriving community, however that's defined at that local level, right? When I think about environmental resilience, again, I like the fact that although I'm a traditional hazards, disaster resilience guy, I still think about resilience in a broader, through a broader lens, right? I think about it in terms of, when you think about the environment, it's not just the natural environment, but also the built environment, as well as the social environment. And so issues about, you know, from exposure to, you know, environmental and natural hazards in the context of flooding or, you know, earthquakes or whatever, to the over-policing of particular communities, right? These are all issues around the environment, and that, you know, particularly people of color and low-income groups have been, you know, adapting to a lot of these issues for a number of years. And so, you know, making sure that we sort of define environment more broadly to include, again, natural, built, and social, and then thinking about resilience as sort of adaptation in the ways that groups have adapted to changing circumstances, and making sure that, you know, it's threaded with both procedural and distributive justice in terms of being able to actually participate in the process, and then also, you know, being able to have actual equitable outcomes manifest in that process.
So now that we've heard what your ideas about these issues are, can you give us just your background and what has led you to understand these issues as you understand them today? Do we want to go left to right or right to left? Or in the middle? Whoever wants to go first.
You did that before. So what led me to doing this work? It was really a matter of experience for me, and I think a lot of folks who probably do, you know, social justice and environmental justice work and are passionate about it, either are in a group and, you know, that is directly experienced or been impacted by environmental justice issues, or it's like 6 degrees of separation from folks who that they care about and loved ones that have been impacted by these issues. And my story is pretty similar. I grew up in an environmental justice community in inner city Dallas, and I noticed that, you know, there were a number of issues even early on that were different from that I saw when I traveled across town to mostly white and affluent neighborhoods. I grew up in a neighborhood where, you know, the liquor and tobacco stores outweighed the healthy food markets like 16-1. An area where the streets were bad and it flooded all the time. But these are just sort of, you know, urban legends in terms of like, we know these particular areas throughout the city, you know, have bad streets and it floods and it's surrounded by industry and landfills and, you know, just not a place that is built or designed to thrive, right? And so you know, a lot of those questions became intuitive through my experience, and really sort of begged the question of what was it about me, my family, the folks that lived in my community that created these circumstances. And so some of those burning questions early on through these lived experiences was sort of what's fundamentally shaped my, you know, research trajectory and my interest in environmental justice.
So for me, it was really not until I got into environmental policy that environmental justice and social justice was even something sort of on my radar. I was a first-generation American, first person to go to college, and when I started to get into my classes, I recognized that in the environmental field, there weren't a lot of Hispanic or brown people, there weren't a lot of black students in my classes, and it was sort of an eye-opener, and it started me down a pathway to think about more about sort of environmental policy throughout the years and think about how communities were built. I grew up in Miami, Florida, where there are greatly, as Willow mentioned, like highways that are completely segregating Hispanic populations from white and white populations from black, and the way that they were designed explicitly to do that was something that became more and more apparent as I went through my studies. And so when I came to the Environmental Finance Center, it was clear to me that if we want to see more representation in the environmental field, and we want to see more representation in our communities talking about these issues, that it has to be done through an environmental justice and social justice lens, because those issues are, again, more prevalent in communities that are underserved.
So for me, I think, much like Marccus, I think I was born into this work, but in a different way. I was born in an inner city community. I was born in an intentional community that had come together around issues of racial and environmental justice. So my father is an immigrant from Taiwan, my mother is African American, and they met to start a community, a active land community in West Virginia, where they literally bought, you know, so many acres of land and started a community land trust. And that was the land on which I was born. And so environmental sustainability is baked in my bones, as is sort of an activist bent towards my work. But I also grew up in rural West Virginia in a place that doesn't sort of reflect those values. So we recycled and composted before it was cool. And we, you know, protested the KKK that walked through my town. So it was a very, there was a lot of contradictions to that work. But when I went to college, you know, I found a place for that kind of activism and that kind of work that I wanted to do. I went to Stanford University for my undergraduate, and I started working in East Palo Alto, which at the time was right next to the community of Palo Alto, which you probably know is one of the wealthiest communities in California, home of Silicon Valley, and right up, literally across the railroad tracks is East Palo Alto, which at the time had the highest murder rate in the state of California. Predominantly an African American community, but was changing at the time with more Latinos coming in. And so they were going through a planning process at the time that I was volunteering there. And I learned the language of planning by volunteering to be a charrette facilitator around housing issues. And seeing communities battle out what housing should look like in this community with so few resources, I learned that housing can be a platform for environmental justice issues. But I also learned that there's a real role and a role for planning in helping communities to realize their own potentials around these issues. So I went from there to work for a law firm around housing and environmental justice work, and it continues to this day.
Feel free to ask questions when you're ready. But as what I found online on each of you, there's lots of work that each of you are working on that seems very powerful. Can you share an example of the work that you are currently working on or have worked on that you think really defines these issues we're talking about today?
So a project that we're currently working on is in partnership with the Maryland Black Mayors Association in Prince George's County. Prince George's County it's a stormwater project where we're helping to build the capacity of the local elected officials and the staff members of these communities of color. Because right now, they are not actually accessing a lot of the resources, technical assistance, and financial capital that they could be to be implementing green infrastructure and stormwater projects on the ground. So we are basically providing technical assistance, education and training, and partnering with the Maryland Black Mayors Association to really help build their capacity, help them understand what resources available to them. The culmination of this project is really going to be that each one of these communities are going to write a grant to the Chesapeake Bay Trust in order to actually get a project implemented on the ground. These are folks who haven't actually tapped into this pot of money, despite the fact that every one of their residents pays into this fund. And so from the environmental finance standpoint, access to capital and access to finance is something that we try to help communities do, and we find that oftentimes underserved communities of color have the hardest time doing that, whether it's from a local government standpoint to just the residents not being able to access funds for loans for housing and things of that nature. So that's something that we're working on.
I'm working on a number of projects right now, and trying to actually, in this moment, wrap my mind around all the projects I'm working on. I guess, one of the projects that actually landed me here at Maryland was some work that I started with two environmental justice groups based out of Houston. And essentially that work was looking at sort of the distribution of stormwater infrastructure and disparities in stormwater infrastructure, particularly important in a place like Houston, right? And I'm sure we all remember just, what was it, last year, where, significant catastrophic flooding in Houston. But essentially this work is really looking at the ways in which Houston has been a sprawling growth machine, and sort of over the last 50 plus years, Houston sort of grew out as a city and annexed a lot of small communities, and some of those communities were, indigenous communities and communities of color, and annexed places to where they could gain access and control of some of their resources, but then not reinvesting in these places in terms of basic amenities and infrastructure. And so one such issue was that in terms of, Houston has two types of stormwater infrastructure, and one of those is open ditches. And open ditches is a type of stormwater infrastructure that's mostly installed in more rural and agricultural type land uses. And essentially, if you could think about, the history of the land in the Houston area, a lot of these places were agricultural and more rural type areas. Obviously, over the years, and as the city grew and urbanized, it became more urban. But as the city grew and changed and became more urban, they never went back and updated the infrastructure to reflect the level of urbanization that took place over time, right? And particularly in places that are mostly occupied by lower income and people of color. And so really looking at the distribution of the types of systems and thinking about the build date and the quality of these systems and the flood risk associated with these systems and where they're located, and thinking about a lot of these open ditch systems in Houston would be overwhelmed by a 10-year flood event, which is a smaller, more everyday routine rainfall and flood event. What we saw from Harvey was upwards of a 500-year plus rainfall event. So if they're overwhelmed by a 10-year flood, they would definitely be overwhelmed and don't stand a chance in the type of storm event that we saw in Harvey. And so really just thinking about, advocating for and working with communities in terms of just basic, protective features in terms of infrastructure, and making sure that they're in a position to be able to resist and just have a fighting chance of being resilient in the face of storms and climate change. And then moving some of that similar work up to the Mid-Atlantic region and starting to do some work between Southeast DC and South Maryland, and around some of these same issues of urban flooding and infrastructure and the impact that they can have on communities in terms of isolation and even thinking about household and generational wealth and the distribution of housing and how repetitive losses and impacts can sort of have these, cascading effects on households. And then even jumping up to Baltimore, one of my more recent projects that I've started to define, and thinking about sanitary sewer overflows in Baltimore, which has been a huge problem that nobody's talking about, surprisingly. And so, and thinking about where these sewer overflows are happening, who's being exposed to them, and what are some of the public health consequences and impacts of these sanitary sewer overflows, because, if these issues aren't addressed with the type of rainfall that we saw here in the state last summer, these things will become more frequent and intense. And so we have to prepare. And again, I think this conversation that we've been having is really a conversation about how low-income people of color have sort of been forced to bear the burden of lack of protection and lack of opportunity in light of some of these everyday issues as well as some of these extreme issues.
So I guess my biggest project as of late has been at the intersection around trends we've been seeing in suburbanization of poverty, especially in the Washington, D.C. area, but this is a trend that goes well beyond Washington, D.C. Many communities now, especially intensely gentrifying inner city communities, are seeing the suburbanization of poverty, and how that intersects with issues that we're seeing around the redevelopment of suburbs, especially in the age of smart growth, where we're trying to make more walkable, more mixed-use, more urban-like suburban communities. We're also seeing that lower income, particularly communities of color, bear the brunt of suburban gentrification, essentially. And so I've been trying to sort of think about what some of these trends mean for those that are most impacted by these trends, and why framing the discourse about gentrification outside of the center city context really matters for the kind of vulnerabilities that communities face when redevelopment comes to town, and also the kind of resources that communities have to fight back, right, to generate more equitable kinds of development in their communities in places like Langley Park, right behind the University of Maryland, where a new Purple Line will be built, and the community has a lot of features that make it particularly vulnerable, from these large swaths of land that have mid-rise garden-style apartments to a lack of ownership in the retail environment, large swaths of retail that can also be impacted pretty heavily by changes in land use and changes in zoning around transit-oriented development. So I've been looking at several different communities that stand to bear the brunts of our new transit-oriented, walkable, mixed-use suburban environments, and looking at the ways that these communities are collectively organizing to fight back. And then through that work, I've been doing a lot of intense work around different kinds of community development issues, in particular communities. So I'll say a little bit about the work in Langley Park, because I think it crosses with the more traditional ideas about environmental justice. So we've been through, because the Purple Line will come through Langley Park, so this Purple Line is a 16-mile light rail line that's going to go from Bethesda, one of the wealthiest areas in our region, into Prince George's County, and cross through some of the most low-income and impoverished parts of our region, and those are the places that would be most heavily impacted. So through the National Center for Smart Growth that runs the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, and also Casa de Maryland, which is the largest immigrant rights organization in the Mid-Atlantic region, they've built coalitions to fight for the rights of residents to remain in place and to benefit from the Purple Line, rather than to bear the brunts and be displaced by the Purple Line. So that ranges from everything from policies around affordable housing and policies to help businesses remain in place, and to help residents to improve the neighborhood by helping to build public parks and leverage the benefits of the new transit line. Through that work, I've also been doing a lot of work specifically in Langley Park around affordable housing. I just finished up a 2-year EPA grant that was about health and housing, and looking at the fact that one of the things that makes the community, that the housing so difficult to maintain in terms of affordability is also an issue of housing quality. In Langley Park, you have an 80% immigrant population living in the community. You have extreme overcrowding in the housing stock. You have mold pests. You have retaliatory landlords. Let's say if you call the county for a leaking pipe, will kick you out because you're undocumented and you don't have your name on the lease anyway. So I worked in coalition with residents, landlords, code enforcement officers to figure out how to improve the health quality, the quality of housing without displacing residents and without raising the rents. And that's been some ongoing work and is now leading to policies in Prince George's County from some of the coalition members that have written legislation that is about everything from what can be charged in rents and whether air conditioners can go in windows to broader tenant rights kind of issues. So I think it's exemplary in the way that environmental justice issues really do cross the spectrum of housing, transportation, and other kinds of more basic community development issues.
We'll open up questions at the end, of course, but if anyone has any questions or comments while we're talking, please feel free to do that. So I guess we could think about this in three scales, the individual, the school, and the global scale. What can we do on these three scales to advance these issues we were talking about, to improve it? Talking about, I guess, individually, and then school-wise, and then globally. This is a heavy one, so feel free to take it.
I think it's my turn to start now. Individually, I think, one of the things I think is really beautiful about this school is that I think it forces us to think about environmental resilience and environmental justice issues beyond, traditional silos and disciplines. So we're not an engineering school, we're not a physical science, where I think these issues are more narrowly defined. And so we are forced to sort of think about the intersections of this issue in this building. And so I think at the individual level, for the students in the room, no matter where your interests lie, whether it is truly in the environment narrowly defined, or whether you're a transportation person, or whether you're a housing person, or whether you're interested in issues of economic development, I think all of these issues touch on issues of social justice and environmental resilience, and I think bringing those frames to the work is really important, and no matter what field you do. So I would say if you, on the individual level, I would say to bring the frames that we're talking about today to bear on your work, I think will add a different dimension to our larger contributions to this discussion. And I think within this building, maybe this goes to the second point around the school, I think that we add a special lens to these discussions because issues of social inequality and environmental resilience are on the national, the global stage in terms of folks trying to address these issues. They are probably amongst the most pressing issues facing, I would say, our planet, our society today. Rising inequality and a lack of a resilient built physical, social environment. And so I think what we in the school offer is that broader lens to think about the ways in which these issues are not narrowly defined as environment in its small e form, but are really things that cross the spectrum, so from community policing and whether people feel safe in their communities to to economic development, whether people have an opportunity in workforce development, right? Whether people have the skills to get jobs, right? These are the things that make communities lack resilience and be able to contribute to a larger platform around climate resilience, right? And so I think bringing those, the ways in which our school can bring those issues together to contribute to the larger discussion and frames around what these issues mean, I think is important. Globally, I think that's the same, to me, that's the same part of the conversation.
This is a very sort of big, broad philosophical question, and how do we put this into practice? So I think for individuals, the students who are in the school now, will eventually be out in the field of practice, I think constantly asking how do our well-intentioned interventions either engage or displace communities of color and low-income communities, right? So constantly reminding yourself and asking yourself, these interventions that we're trying to promote, what are those unforeseen consequences, and how do we make sure that it's more inclusive and engaging? That's sort of, I guess, a mantra that just runs through the back of your head as you practice and you work. And then as a school, I think helping, continuing to try to build a community practice that is diverse and representative, and helping to really build the capacity of young folks who might be entering these types of programs, or building pipelines of students who are interested in this topic that look more diverse, or that are good allies when they go out into the world and practice things like architecture, planning, development, things like that. It's all the same. You start at the bottom and you just really try to build the capacity. I mean, the Environmental Finance Center, what we're all about is building capacity, whether it's education or financial capacity, political capital, really trying to work with the community so that we're not just parachuting in and providing like a one-time Band-Aid fix, but really helping to build their knowledge base and their agency so that when we leave, one, they know they can still call us and we can help, but two, that they feel empowered to take the action on themselves.
Yeah, I think I would say that this really is about sort of the opportunity of having open and honest conversations like this here in these moments, because they're important. And sort of also being honest with ourselves about how we actually got here, right? And particularly in the context of climate change and, the emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases. And historically, we think about how the built environment over the years through industrialization has really transpired. It always has been lower income and communities of color who have been the brunt of, some of these issues, who were left behind. And I think if we think about sort of that first wave of suburbanization and how the inner city was polluted and people who were mobile and had the resources and opportunity to flee, in fact, did, and left, again, low income and communities of color behind. And if we think about it now, it has been automobiles and industry that has contributed most heavily to sort of a change in climate. And so now that we recognize this as an issue and we're starting to make adaptations and we're starting to try and mitigate pollution and the things that are changing our climate, making sure that we don't continue business as usual, right? And that we don't perpetuate the same inequalities that we've seen and witnessed over the years. And I think also too, recognizing that, that we have to get at the root causes of these issues and be comfortable having uncomfortable conversations about racism and classism and sexism and how these things intersect with just about everything that we do as social people, right? And also at the individual level as academics and students, as relatively educated people, that we don't continue to be this do as I say, not as I do group of people, right? And I think we tend to be that group, right? We tend to be that group that in our professional spaces, we talk the talk and we advocate, but then in our personal lives, we do the complete opposite, or we don't walk in that same path, right? And I think it's important because it's like, yeah, in our professional lives, we talk about the importance of public transit as an opportunity to minimize how many cars are on the road that then leads to emissions and climate change, and how we should have more inclusive environments. But then we leave here, we get in our, not to anybody who drives a Mercedes or anything, right? But we get in our Mercedes and we drive to our gated communities that are, you know, homogenous and things like that. And so just really just making sure that, you know, we have a connection and our professional personal lives are threaded in a way that we're actually like constantly living is what we're talking throughout our days. It was funny, a couple of years ago, Dave Chappelle did an opening monologue for SNL, and he was talking about, you know, honestly, in this age of Trumpism and all of the things that are going on, if I could turn off my blackness, I would be out the game right now, right? Because there's so much going on, right? And it's kind of like I was telling somebody the other day that it's like, I don't have an option. Like, the burden of speaking up and speaking out about these issues is not something that I can choose when and where I want to. It's like, in front of you all today, you know, I'm Dr. Hendricks talking about environmental justice, and as soon as I walk out of here, it's like I'm still a black man walking around, and in my personal life, I guess the best way to position myself to where I'm not at the very bottom is to be an educated black man. And if I was a rich black man, that would probably be a little bit closer to not having to sort of deal with the issues that my family and other people who are not in, you know, as privileged of a position as we all are in, that they deal with every single day, right? And so I say all of that to say, at that individual level, making sure that, again, we get comfortable having uncomfortable conversation, and we have a continuity between our personal and professional lives. At a school level, I guess taking, you know, the training that you all receive from us and from your other professors and instructors, and don't leave it behind as you go out into practice. I think, you know, some of the disappointing things that I see is that, you know, when students, you know, you take Willow's multicultural metropolis class, and she talks about all of these social justice issues that are absolutely critical. You take my class around, you know, environmental justice and resilience, and you learn these things, but then you get into practice and you're working for local governments or you work for private industry, and you get stifled by these structures and these institutions, and you leave behind some of these very critical perspectives that are absolutely necessary in terms of actually, you know, outcomes and what I touched on from the very beginning, because we're at a point where it's not just about opportunities, but actual outcomes. And you all, as practitioners and folks who will be shaping the built environment for years to come, are sort of the liaison and the brokers between, you know, actually creating these places and spaces that people depend in order to survive and sort of live, you know, a thriving life in light of, you know, social environmental changes and or natural environmental changes.
So I just have two more questions, and anyone else, of course. And it's funny, of course, this thing just popped up. But on two screens, on the left, we have items that we would like to protect and items that we would like to change. I guess we started change while we wait for the protect to come back up. But Brandy and Willow, can you explain why you picked these images that you selected?
Sure. So for the change image, I have the picture of some of the Langley Park housing that we've been working on helping to shift the quality of the housing without displacing the residents who live in it. So that's this housing picture that's up right now under the change. And so it's thinking about how do you change the conditions of housing without displacing the residents who live there, right? How do you improve the housing stock? How do you build a more resilient community? Because right now, 75% of the community in Langley Park is all renters, right? It has one of the highest poverty rates of communities in Maryland. It has no opportunity to move up in the community without moving out of the community, meaning that if you want to purchase, if you want to become a homeowner, you can't become a homeowner and still stay in Langley Park, but it's a deeply connected community where people want to be able to remain in that community. So how do you change the housing stock? How do you create opportunities for homeownership? How do you create opportunities to live in more environmentally healthy housing without increasing the cost of housing and without displacing the residents from that community? So I think, to me, the questions around change and housing in particular in Langley Park are complex and important. The protect image that I chose was the small businesses in Langley Park, where it represents some of the most diverse kinds of businesses of anywhere that I've seen. It's largely immigrant-owned businesses, largely community-serving businesses, a full range of diverse kinds of services in the community that are very much geared towards the needs of that community. And so how do you protect that kind of diversity, that kind of local serving institutions that are so vital to how people think about the quality and the health of their community? And how do you do that? How do you protect that without protecting the housing and the residents who live there and this vital connection that people have between the places that they live, work, shop, and play? And so I think those two are very much connected for me.
So I actually chose an image of one of our community engagement meetings in Marccus County. And while we have a really, really great and engaged body of citizens who come out to our meetings regularly, it's not always the most diverse. And that's for a number of reasons. One is we work a lot with local elected officials, and there is not enough representation, I think, with local elected officials. Oftentimes we'll go into a community that is predominantly African American and still see that the elected officials are overwhelmingly white, which is always confusing to me. And so most people try to stay away from politics, and most people are like kind of, I'll vote, but I don't want to actually get civically engaged. And so one of the things I like to see as change over time is just more youth becoming civically engaged, more people of color becoming civically engaged, people who are in places of privilege stepping back and providing a space for other folks to have a voice. So working with our communities, we're definitely trying to get more civic engagement, more participation from our underserved communities, from communities of color, from our low-income communities. And it's hard work, and you have to be intentional about it. So that's my change image. And then for protect, I used a couple of different sort of environmental images, which I work with. So the Chesapeake Bay and the tributaries are one thing that we are very heavily invested in, and trying to make sure that all communities can really enjoy these resources, and then also building green spaces in communities, not just protecting the Chesapeake Bay and the environment, but making sure we can bring the environment back into our communities.
And Marccus, to put you on the spot, can you help us visualize an image you would like us to protect?
Yes, you did.
So, I guess envision an image of something to change and something to protect. Yikes. Something to change. I think, I guess something to change is what I've seen in my work is that as we roll out these adaptations to climate change and more severe weather, the investments that should have went in years ago to protect the people who were originally there are now taking place after the fact, after they've been pushed out or gentrified, right? And so I would change that in terms of making sure that, again, as we roll out these adaptations, that the people who originally should have and could have been protected, need to be protected, and being able to stay put and take advantage of sort of these adaptations and investments that we're making. Because it's important, and I think we're seeing it in DC, we're seeing it in just about every major city in the country in terms of the introduction of green space, investments in, you know, critical infrastructures, things that should have been there to protect folks years ago are just now happening as the neighborhoods and communities turn over. And that has to change, right? We have to make sure that we, you know, that we invest in communities regardless of what they look like or what the makeup of them are, and making sure that, you know, again, these communities who have bear the brunt over the years are actually able to take advantage as we sort of move forward and become resilient, right? And then in terms of protecting, right? I think that sort of tethered to my vision of change is that what I would protect is the valuing of people and places, and protecting sort of the experiences and the culture of groups that are, you know, at the threat of climate change, and as we think about maybe, you know, retreating from coastal areas, as we think about buying out homes and communities and environmentally sensitive areas, that we do it with humility and we do it with a social conscience, that we value people and places, and that we protect these people and places equally, right? And so, yeah, I guess sort of an image of sort of, you know, protecting the culture, protecting people, protecting experiences, and making sure that we place value on these things. I think something I was watching on the news the other day with the go-go music in DC, right, that very much so, like, you know, a cultural thing for indigenous Washingtonians, and particularly people of color, black folks in DC. And as the neighborhood is turning over, it's kind of like they're trying to erase, you know, the cultural fabric of, you know, the historical cultural fabric of these communities, and it's important to protect it, right? And so, as we said, in the spirit of environmental justice, that's a part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So my final question, I don't know what the best question is on it. It's funny that these are now like this, but I'm taking this from Julie. What role does technology play in your work? Is technology the solution for our future? What role is technology in your lives?
Well, it's not the solution, but it does proliferate our lives today. So I think we need to think about technology as a tool, not as a solution. So technology offers us the ability to see things in a different way, but so does talking to a person that gives you a new perspective in life. It gives you the ability to collect data, big data if you want to, but small data is really important. And people's experiences and their stories are just as important as being able to tell a sort of data point from, you know, 100,000 people. So I think technology is absolutely not the solution, but it can be part of the solution. I think solutions come from the ground up. They come from listening to communities and what communities want to see, and helping them to leverage their assets, their abilities, their resources, and helping them to leverage outside resources to get what communities want, deserve, and value, with attention to the fact that the communities who are most overlooked and that the communities who don't get what they want often tend to be the low-income communities of color that we're talking about. And so where we leverage new technologies, where we leverage new data to come to bear, I think are part of our responsibilities is into those communities that are most under-resourced. But I think, you know, I think the fascination with technology as a solution is a problem in and of itself. Even as I do work on smart cities today, which is the new thing that everybody's is on the tip, my concern in that discussion is making sure that communities have a voice
and what kinds of technologies are being brought to bear in their communities. And so if we're doing a smart trash can or a smart street light, do we need a smart trash can or a smart street light, or do we have smart trash flows? And have the street lights in our communities ever been replaced? Or is this just yet another technology that's going to exacerbate the problems and not actually help to address community problems? So I think we need to be very suspicious of the ways in which technology are often seen as helping communities figure out issues that they actually already know the answers to. And technology may be helpful in that conversation, but it's not necessarily.
I think, technology, especially in the age of smart cities, it's a part of it. It's going to be here and it's not going anywhere. I think what we have to do is really sort of find a balance between technology and sort of technological solution and practical solution. I think that, when we talk about, the Dutch have this concept of living with water, right? And ways that we can advance technology and structural solutions to live with water. And we think about the history of, places along, particularly along the southeastern coast of the United States, marginalized communities, one community that I'm working with downstream here in North Brentwood, a historical place that was set aside for black soldiers returning from the Civil War, right? The lowest lying land that was prone to flooding since the beginning of time. And so that isn't a unique, circumstance. It's a lot of, low-income communities of color across the U.S. that have been living in floodplains and low-lying areas for a number of years and have been living with water, right? And haven't had technology or haven't had structural solutions, but have adapted in ways that I think the science and policies have yet to capture and recognize, right? And so finding that balance between how folks are practically doing these things and how they're doing it with technology and finding that balance. And I say that, again, although starting to work in the smart cities arena, and, again, just making sure we find the balance. But I also wanted to say one thing. So for the planners in the room, one of my favorite planners of all time is a guy by the name of Paul Davidoff. And Paul Davidoff, he said once that the city planning profession's historic concern with the physical environment or technological environment has warped the ability to see technological structures and land as servants to those who use them. Technological relations and conditions have no meaning or quality apart from the way that they serve their users. But this is forgotten every time a physical or technological condition is described as good or bad without relation to a specified group of users. High density, low density, smart cities, green belts, mixed use, centers, whatever, are neither good or bad per se. They only describe physical or technological relations or conditions, but take on value only when seen in terms of their social, economic, psychological, physiological, and aesthetic effects upon different users, right? And I think that, Davidoff wrote this years ago, and he was mostly talking about, No, I was paraphrasing something. He was talking about physical conditions, right? But I sort of intertwined it with technology and smart cities, but is obviously very much so relevant today. And I think that that's what we have to be suspicious and cautious of, to make sure that as we talk about these smart and technological solutions, that we only describe them in terms of the impacts and effects that they have on communities and the social world.
Go before me. That's like the perfect thing to end on. I'll just throw my last thought out there, echoing what Willow and Marccus were saying. It's a tool. It's definitely not a solution, and depending on how we choose to use it, will be how much progress we can make. I think really it's moral imperative and social priorities that are going to dictate how we use these tools and these resources to help communities advance. Technology can be expensive, so I'll keep echoing capacity of community, right? Both financial and education and understanding of how to use these technologies. Do they even have access to the capital to implement these technologies? Again, it's a social imperative for us to think about how are we making sure we can deploy these advanced technologies into communities that don't necessarily have the resources. How do we prioritize them? Because we know the more affluent communities can deploy this technology on their own. Right? We don't want to make sure we're investing in the communities that can already do for themselves. We want to make sure we help empower and build the capacity of those communities.
Does anyone on the board have any questions?
Can anyone just say briefly what smart cities are? It sounds like a buzzword to me.
It is.
We don't have to talk about smart
You
cities.
said Paul Davidoff said smart cities, so. I think smart tech cities are the deployment of technology around governance issues in cities, and particularly around infrastructure in cities, to help cities have a better interface with the public, right? So part of the smart cities discourse is just about the interface between governance and the public, but then there's this infrastructure side of smart cities, which is fundamentally, I think, about employing technology for more efficient use of public infrastructure. So how we get data, how we use data that we can collect in cities to make the functioning of cities more efficient. And I think, again, what we understand from being in this building is that efficiency should not rule how we govern cities, right? And so technology is often about employed so that we can pick up the trash quicker and we don't have to pick it up if it's not full, right? So we can do these self-compacting trash cans, but that's putting a smart trash can out of a job, right? And so if we're not looking at the balance between the efficiency, the economic opportunities, and the social justice issues that employs, then we're not actually creating smarter communities.
Yeah, I think you described it perfectly. When I define city planning for folks who aren't familiar with the field, I talk about it as sort of the study of the structure and function of communities and cities, right? I think smart cities is really the ways in which we implement technology to make more efficient the structure and function of communities. I think that it's really about sort of that efficiency in terms of how we do what we've been doing, but faster, more efficiently, but also making sure that the intention behind what we're doing is placed properly. And as I think about, again, sort of Baltimore, the deployment of more cameras making a community smarter, right? But then the intention behind it of using those cameras to just exacerbate or further exploit the over-policing of communities is problematic, right? And so I think making sure that, again, that the intentionality of what we're doing and making cities smarter is properly placed, and it's just not a question of efficiency.
I know, it seems like if you ask the question, how can we use this technology to have a more equitable and fair and just distribution of resources, that would be a completely different lens.
That's not where the technology is going. The technology is being driven by the technologists who can create cool gadgets and more efficient means that they can essentially sell cities, right? To sell to cities. And so, but they're not about problem solving in communities. They're not about figuring out what is important to you. Feeling safe in your community, having access to jobs, having access to affordable housing. How do we create a technology around access to affordable housing? We don't have that technology because that's not the question that's being asked. And so I think as our job of planners and people who think about these questions, I think our job in the smart cities is to push those kind of questions and to ask, what does smart cities have to do with the creation of affordable housing? What does it have to do
with the resilience of small businesses. And then we start to get a different kind of conversation about smart cities as opposed to what technology is coming down the pike now and how do we use it.
First of all, thank you guys. I could listen to this discussion all day. This has been really good, so thank you for making the time for this. Willow, you talked about Langley Park quite a bit, and obviously the purple line's going to run right through Langley Park. What are some of the things that planners could do or be thinking about to make sure that an incredible transit project like that coming to the community doesn't tear up that fabric or displace the community that's there?
Get engaged. So, I've been at this university for, well, I went through as a master's student and now I'm here as a faculty member. And I have been shocked that we have communities that are right outside of our doorsteps that our university does not engage in any systematic and sustained way. So I started working in Langley Park when I was a master's student because Bill Hanna was here and he ran Action Langley Park, which was, the only group that I knew at that time that was working and the university has been here for 150 years, right? And so how can we have community right outside of our door that we're not engaging, that has such vulnerabilities right now? How can we not have a commitment to working in communities throughout Prince George's County that have these environmental disparities? As a university, I think it's deplorable, right? And it's irresponsible. And so I think there's a lot of strategies that can be used to mitigate the impacts of what's happening in Langley Park. And part of my role with these various coalitions is to come up with those strategies. But there's so much work. There's so much work in the schools. There's so much work around, public safety. There's so much work around air pollutants in Langley Park and all environmental justice communities and throughout Prince George's County. So I think, to me, the onus is to really just figure out how to engage communities responsibly and to go and listen to what communities want and to figure out how to leverage the resources of the university towards those goals, right? And so not coming in with I have this cool technology, cool data set, cool thing to offer you, but how do I leverage the platform of the university to help communities to achieve their goals? And I think that begins with responsible engagement.
And just to add on to that, I think there's also, I talked about procedural and sort of distributive justice, and I think in terms of engagement, we engage people who sort of the investment or the technology was intended for, right? If we go back and look at sort of the plan, how the planning around the Purple Line unfolded and who was engaged and who was at the meetings, right? It should have been things put in place before ground even broke related to the Purple Line that weren't, right? And so, because that's the only way to protect these groups is to really put in things like community land trusts, etc., in place before you even break ground to where the communities are already protected prior to the investment, right? And I think that it's reflective in terms of a lack of procedural justice. It's reflective of a lack of engagement and a lack of intention for who the Purple Line was intended for. And it wasn't intended for these immigrant and low-income communities of color, and that's why they probably largely weren't a part of the process and the planning for the Purple Line, and are vulnerable to being displaced as a result of it.
And that's certainly true in the history of the Purple Line. The reason why these coalitions are now coming together is because the voices of communities of Bethesda and Chevy Chase were coming out in full force asking for their golf courses to be protected and their walking trails to be protected. And here we have on the other side of the line communities that are set to be wholesalely displaced in terms of their residential, their commercial, their cultural assets, and nobody's fighting for a voice for these communities. And we have less protections in place, or if not any, no protections in place for these communities. And so it starts with that basic conversation about who's this for.
Question. So how do you all see us as a school being able to influence those groups? Like, I see things like I live in Hyattsville and they're redoing Adelphi Road down to the district line. And all these things are coming from the state. Okay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna make this median, we're gonna put trees in because we took trees out, but they've gone through like the upper part of Queen's Chapel, which goes to Adelphi, Queen's Chapel, Michigan. And they took away like entrances to the neighborhoods on different sides. And the people in the neighborhood are like, yo, hang on, you know, why are you doing this? And they have been involved, but it's a battle. It's been going on for like 2 years. They're finally like they're going to reconsider some things. But so in things like that, at the purple line, how do you see us as a school being able to get in there and influence? Like, is it that we make noise with the state level or the upper jurisdictions, or do we try to rally the people, the community level, in order to be able to get some sense of ownership in these projects?
I think the answer is always all of the above, right? You have to have that top-down, bottom-up approach, and it takes effort and intentionality in making sure that you actually get out into the community and rally the correct troops. Get all the voices heard. I'll also say that Marccus mentioned something earlier, sort of long-term, right? Not what you do right now, but Marccus had mentioned how the people in this room are going to go out and be urban planners and designers of our built environment for years to come. So one thing now that's from Hendricks is, as a school, making sure that nobody leaves these doors without a strong environmental justice, social justice perspective. So when they go out there and start to redesign the world, in front of us, that these things are being taken into consideration in that early stage of development before ground has been broken.
And I think also too is that, my grandmother always used to say charity starts at home, right? And I think that as a school, we have several different opportunities to do studios abroad and do, all these special projects all over the world, and those things are great. But then, right in our backyard, communities are being displaced and are being disproportionately impacted by a number of issues. And so I think as a school, we really need to do some introspection and ask ourselves, like, have we found a balance in terms of all of these sort of novel or broad opportunities for our students, which are important and wonderful opportunities, but making sure that we're also getting our hands dirty right in our backyard for communities that, could, use a lot of our resources and our agency to support them and so just making sure that, we sort of think about that in our long-term strategic planning and visioning about whether it's pedagogy or projects or whatever, that we sort of think about communities that are right here that are in need of our help and support, and not just sort of dismiss them because we want to go to business or we want to go to these other places, that are, I want to go to business too. I also want to make sure that, North Brentwood isn't being flooded, right? And so.
And I would just add very quickly that I think while we teach sort of how to go out and engage communities, we often don't teach politics, right? Which I think is really important to understand that what we do and the changes that we make in communities are very political. And they take building power and capacity in a very politicized way. So I think one of the things that we can do in addition to everything that's already been said is actually teach power and politics more directly and teach folks to be able to navigate those inside of settings and understand that we can't sit in a neutral position and say, well, we're just giving data to this community, or we're just helping to realize somebody's vision, right? Those are all very political decisions, and we need to figure out where we stand as a school and individuals and how we help communities to build power to make progressive change.
I have a couple of questions. But before the questions, I feel to express my gratitude for you all for organizing this, because I appreciate very much the theme, that is a subject that is not treated enough, in my opinion, at least from my point of view, because of the attitude that is inclusive, which is not very common either, and for the format that is, I think, inclusive to exchange of ideas. Now, the question, I study sustainability. That's that I'm a student of sustainability. I teach urban design, but about 10 years ago, I got suspicious that the policies that I was hearing about sustainability were not really sustainable. And so I started studying more. And in the meantime, I have confirmed in my mind the idea that in fact, there is a problem with sustainability of our sustainability policies, and in fact, there is, and it seems to me that there is a persistent conflict in the policies that look at the different aspects, the three legs of sustainability. So, most times, sustainability policies that look at the environment are conflicting with the sustainability of our social and economic background. So, having said that, this all this preamble to back the question, which is when we look for achievements, I find the struggle of measuring this achievement, and in the sense that all the parameters that we use are good but are not enough. And so, would you spend some word about this? And in the specific, how does happiness and beauty enters in this field?
No, I think a lot of your preamble is spot on in terms of, I teach a Gen Ed undergraduate sustainability course here, right? On the first day of class, I ask my students, like, what does green mean to you? What does sustainability mean to you? And a lot of them spout out, environmentally friendly, eco-friendly, and all of these sort of green ideologies, but it's like, that's not sustainability. And in terms of thinking about that triple bottom line, if it fundamentally doesn't include social equity and some dimension of justice and equity, then it's in fact not sustainable, right? And it's not sustainability. And so when we talk about eco-friendly or environmentally friendly, that's fine, but it's just eco-friendly and environmentally friendly. It's not sustainability. And I think it's important that we sort of have those conversations and recognize that. And in turn, I forgot what was the second part of it.
Happiness and beauty.
Happiness and beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think the issue too in terms of metrics and parameters is that, again, the benchmarks and parameters have been set by a homogeneous group and privileged groups, and it's the same way in the issues that we're running into in my world of resilience, is that resilience for whom, to whom, and determined by whom, right? And I think that, right now we're in this place that we think about metrics for sustainability and resilience in relation to privileged white people, right? And whatever that benchmark or threshold is, when in fact, that's not necessarily true, and we're thinking about it as the inverse of vulnerability, right? And if we think about vulnerability as sort of these really superficial, variables of race and income, we think about, oh, well, if we just get rid of all of the poor and people of color, then we're much more resilient. In an outcomes instance, that might be true, but it's not absolutely true, right? Because I think that, you know, there are ways in which people of color are resilient and sustainable that, again, aren't a part of how we formally, you know, a part of these formal indices and metrics, and that's an issue, right? And so, again, really, in fact, yeah, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, because I think sustainability and resilience are in the eyes of the beholder in terms of how places and people have been sustainable and resilient, and making sure that we create a space within academia, within the design world, within science, within technology, that we provide an opportunity for these people who have been historically disenfranchised and marginalized to have influence and agency and voice on how we measure, how we monitor, how we map, how we discuss what sustainability and resilience actually looks like.
And I would just add that I think that sustainability measures need to come from a different place, right? So we can't have a standard set of sustainability measures to tell us whether this community X is sustainable or community Y is sustainable, right? Because that's not how sustainability works. We need to ask communities, first of all, so if you go into a community and you ask them what is sustainability to you, most likely environmental factors, well, in the communities that we care about and are talking about today, mostly environmental factors will not rise to the top, right? Because if we don't have jobs, if we don't feel safe in our communities, then we don't have a sustainable, resilient environment. If we don't have good schools where our kids can go and learn and get a job after that, we don't have a sustainable community. So sustainability policies and metrics are being driven by environmentally focused goals and environmentally focused research, and folks who have a sort of who have that interest in mind. Whether they have this broader interest around community sustainability and resilience in the ways in which communities themselves define what that is a different question. So I think we need to push back about those measures and actually define measures in the ways that communities themselves think about building resilience and sustainability. And if we do that, then I think we'll start to get a different sense about what some of these policies are, right? So bike lanes in communities or bike gaming communities, you know, whether or not we need to use that as a measure of sustainability when for some communities bikes are a harbinger of gentrification, right? And so we think about that as our common measure, then I think we're going to miss the ways in which people think about themselves and their own capacities to build more resilient environments. And we're going to miss the policies that will actually help to define their own resilient future.
Sure. So I think it's unsurprising that sustainability is sort of flipped backwards, right? So environment is sort of the lead in this discussion, but historically I would say that people of color, Hispanics, African Americans have been left out of a lot of the disciplines that led to sustainability, right? Our architects, our planners, our environmentalists, our lawyers, our doctors. Most of these people historically have been white and white men. So it's not surprising that the sustainability indicators we currently have today don't reflect what actually needs to happen for everyone to live in a sustainable world. I think, again, building that pipeline to make sure that we have more diversity and building a pipeline of better allyship to make sure that we start to change those indicators is very important. But a lot of voices have been suppressed over time, and that's reflected in all parts of our society, not just in the sustainability movement, but throughout. And so thinking through, our unconscious bias through all the disciplines we partake in and saying, well, who's left out when this discipline was developed to begin with? And how do we make sure that we bring everybody up to speed and make sure that we have that inclusion so that we can restructure what we think about when we say sustainability? And it really should be social justice on top, right? Because that's the only way we're going to to make sure that it is inclusive for everyone.
And I just wanted to add one other thing is that I think we've been so concerned as a science in terms of doing things to communities as opposed to doing it with them and or listening to them. If we really think about it, you know, this walkability concept really started to gain popularity somewhere around 2011, right? But if you
Funding walkability studies.
yeah, right. And so it's like, but if you think about the communities that I work in, they've been walking forever and without sidewalks, right? Like, and so a lot of these communities have been riding a bus, been walking, doing a lot of sustainable behaviors that we just don't recognize and acknowledge them, right? The issues that we're facing, quite frankly, on a country or international global scale, like Americans, we're at the top of the list in terms of contributing to these climate change issues. If we sort of think about within an American context, it's been the white, gated, privileged communities, suburban communities that have contributed the most because again, it's been a matter of opportunity. Like these lower income communities of color didn't have individual automobiles. They didn't have, you know, a number of things that have, again, in terms of the industry, have contributed to a changing climate. But then again, to also touch on something that Willow said is that I think that communities are brilliant in their own right, and they understand the importance of sort of environmentally friendly and sustainability, and are doing things again, which I mentioned, that are sustainable, whether it's like cultivating the land or growing food. A lot of indigenous communities have been doing these things, but again, we just have yet to recognize it, but they also understand that they have competing demands and there are a hierarchy of needs, and so they don't have, if you will, sort of the intellectual or environmental freedom to explore some of these sustainable ideas because they're worried about putting food on the table, or they're worried about, you know, not getting pulled over by the police and becoming a hashtag, right? Like these are real challenges and issues for these communities. And again, we have to recognize, one, the behaviors that they have been doing that are in fact sustainable, and making sure that we address root causes and competing demands in terms of these hierarchy of needs in order to actually, you know, get to a place collectively of sustainability.
And I think when we're able to do that, the residents will feel like their community is beautiful, and they will be happy, right? So that'll come.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. As someone mentioned earlier, we probably could discuss this for hours. We want to thank you so much for your time. This was a really thoughtful conversation. I think all of us will leave here thinking how we could be more engaged on an individual basis, but also how can we engage the communities right in our backyard more responsibly. And as Marccus put it, being more comfortable with the uncomfortable conversations. So before we leave, please take some more bagels. I have a sign-up sheet if we could all just sign up for the gallery attendance.